For 3 years, nobody in the Ferraro house was allowed to touch the white piano in the Great Hall. Not to dust it. Not to lift the lid. Not to play a single note. The staff learned that rule the way people learn where the ice is thin, and nobody tested it twice. Alessio Ferraro was 33 years old, and he ran one of the oldest families in Chicago from a house with 40 rooms, and no music in any of them. He didn't shout. That was the thing people got wrong about him. When Alessio raised his voice, you were fine. When he lowered it, you left the room. Then came the night the rule broke. It was almost 2 a.m, with rain coming off the lake hammering the windows, when he came home and heard something he hadn't heard in 3 years. Piano. Real piano, coming from his own great hall. He crossed that hallway, ready to fire whoever was sitting on that bench, and then he stopped in the doorway and couldn't move. The woman at the keys was Adeline Marsh, 28 years old, the night nurse he'd hired 6 weeks earlier to look after his sister. She was still in her scrubs from a 12-hour shift, hospital badge clipped to her chest, hair coming loose, a compression glove on her left hand that she never took off in front of anyone. 4 fingers under that glove had been broken so badly, 9 years ago, that doctors told her she wouldn't play again. And yet there she sat, crying without knowing she was crying, her ruined hand moving across those keys like it remembered something the rest of her had spent 9 years trying to forget. But that wasn't what stopped Alessio Ferraro in the doorway of his own home. It was the song. Because that piece of music had never been recorded. It had never been performed. It had never even been finished. And there wasn't a single page of it written down anywhere in this world. It belonged to his wife, and his wife had been dead for 3 years. Alessio put a hand flat against his chest, the way a man does when he's trying to hold something closed. And he felt the whole locked-up architecture of the last 3 years start to come apart inside him. This stranger in a hospital badge was playing the ending Beatrice never lived to write. Every man who worked for him was afraid of him. Not one of them had ever seen his face do what it was doing right now. He asked her one question, quiet, the way he only ever spoke when everything was about to change. How do you know that song? And the answer Adeline Marsh gave him was the beginning of everything. If you believe a person's worth has nothing to do with the uniform they wear, stay with me. Give this video a like so more people find it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the night that white piano finally made a sound. That autumn, before the rainy night, there was a dinner in the small dining room on the ground floor of the Ferraro mansion. Only 4 people were there. Alessio sat at the head of the table. Bruno Lazzari stood behind his chair, both hands clasped in front of him, neither sitting nor eating. Across from Alessio was Sal Tirano, a middle-aged man who had served the family since the days when Alessio's father could still walk. He wore the finest coat he owned. He had shaved. He arrived well ahead of the appointed hour, and the gatekeeper said he sat in his car for a long time before finally stepping out. Dinner was served as usual. Rosie brought in the soup, then withdrew to the kitchen and didn't return, because she had lived in that house long enough to know that dinners with only 4 people didn't require a server. Alessio asked how Sal's wife was doing. Sal said she was much the same, that her knees still hurt whenever the weather turned cold. Alessio said he would have someone send medicine to her. Sal thanked him. Their conversation moved through the weather, Sal's granddaughter having just started college, and a restaurant in the old neighborhood that was about to close. No one mentioned money. Then Alessio set down his spoon, wiped his mouth, and said the accountant had reported several discrepancies in the mutual aid fund. He spoke with perfect calm, in the voice of a man asking what the weather would be like tomorrow. Sal began to explain. He spoke about emergency expenses, about 2 families with relatives in the hospital, about paperwork that had gone missing during an office move. He spoke about a contractor who owed money and had promised to repay it once the city project paid out. He talked for quite a while. Alessio didn't interrupt him once. He listened with what seemed like genuine attention, nodding now and then, sometimes even asking about a detail so Sal would continue. The longer Sal spoke, the slower his voice became, like a man descending a staircase in the dark, who was beginning to suspect there might not be another step beneath his foot. At last, he stopped and looked down at his plate. Alessio picked up the wine bottle, poured him a glass with his own hand, and gently pushed it across the table. Sal didn't dare refuse it. Then Alessio said, still in the same voice, that the route on the west side of the city had been transferred to someone else at the beginning of the week, that the papers had been signed on Tuesday, and that everyone involved had already been informed. Sal looked up. For one moment, his face concealed nothing. He understood that the judgment had already been handed down before he entered the house, that all evening he had been defending himself in a case that had already been decided, and that the question about the missing money had never really been a question. It had been a courtesy. Alessio had given him the chance to tell the truth before everything closed around him, and Sal had used that chance to tell stories about a contractor and a city payout. Sal placed one hand on the edge of the table. He said Alessio's name once, only once, and then stopped. Alessio said he still remembered how Sal had carried him on his shoulders at a relative's wedding, back when Alessio hadn't yet grown tall enough to reach an adult's waist. He said that because of that memory, nothing more would happen tonight, and Sal should go home and tend to his wife's aching knees. Then he picked up his fork and continued eating. Sal remained seated for a while. No one told him to stand. No one escorted him to the door. He rose on his own, pushed his chair back into place, and walked into the hallway alone. And the sound of the door closing carried into the dining room more softly than anyone might have expected. Bruno still hadn't moved. 3 plates of food remained on the table, and none of them had been finished. Afterward, Bruno asked whether Alessio needed him to do anything else. Alessio said no. Bruno asked if they should have someone watch Sal for a few days. Alessio said Sal wouldn't go anywhere, because when a man reached that age and lost everything that had made his name mean something, he usually just went home and sat in his kitchen for a very long time. There was no satisfaction in the way he said it, and that sent a deeper chill down Bruno's spine than any threat he had ever heard. Alessio went upstairs through the main hallway. The house was dark and silent, with lights burning only at a few corners. He passed through the great hall, where the white piano stood beneath its cloth covering, and he didn't turn his head. He hadn't turned toward it once in 3 years. It was the only thing in that house he didn't dare look at directly. That same autumn, on the other side of the city, in a low building with a gray roof called Cedar Grove, a woman sat beside the window every afternoon without being able to speak a single word. June Marsh had once taught music at a church in Bronzeville. She had possessed a voice her students remembered for the rest of their lives, a voice that knew how to rise into song and how to fall very low when telling a story. Now she had only her eyes. Every Thursday afternoon, Adeline came after her shift, carrying a comb and a bottle of grapefruit oil her mother had loved since Adeline was a child. She pulled a chair behind her, separated each lock of hair, and combed slowly from the roots to the ends, taking special care around the nape of her neck, where her mother's scalp was sensitive. June sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the courtyard where several maple trees were changing color. Then Adeline began to hum. There were no words, only the melody of an old song her mother used to play on the upright piano in the corner of their living room, back when they still had that house. Adeline had hummed only a few measures when June stirred. Then a sound emerged from the throat of the woman who could no longer speak, hoarse and broken, so far out of time with her daughter that a stranger wouldn't have recognized it as music. But Adeline recognized it. She always did. She lowered her voice and slowed the melody to wait for her mother, and for those few brief minutes, the two women sang together in the only way they had left. June's eyes brightened. Her hand searched for the edge of her daughter's shirt and held on there. Adeline combed her mother's hair until the light outside the window turned the color of copper, and she didn't let her mother see her face. Out in the hallway, an employee from the billing office called her back. The woman looked uncomfortable, holding a sheet of paper in both hands as though it were heavy. The cost of care would be adjusted at the beginning of the next quarter. The increase would apply to every long-term resident, and Mrs. Marsh's account was already 2 payments behind. Adeline read the paper twice. She asked what would happen if she couldn't find the money in time. The employee said there was a public facility in the southern part of the state that was still accepting patients, only it was far away. Adeline asked how far. In the voice of someone who had answered that question many times before, the woman said the drive took nearly half a day. Adeline folded the paper into quarters, thanked her, and walked out to the parking lot. She sat in her car for a long time before putting the key into the ignition. That evening, Tandy Boyle stopped by the apartment with 2 cartons of noodles and the face of someone who had just finished a 12-hour shift in the emergency room. Tandy sat down on the floor with her back against the couch, took 2 bites, and began to talk. A family on Lake Shore was looking for a private duty nurse. It was a night shift, living in the house, with pay 3 times what Adeline was making now, plus insurance. Tandy said the place went through nurses the way people changed bedsheets. Everyone who took the job lasted only a few weeks before disappearing, and no one ever said why. Adeline asked what was wrong with the patient. Tandy said she had heard it was a young woman with a spinal injury, confined to a wheelchair and living with chronic pain. But that wasn't the difficult part. The difficult part was the family. Adeline asked which family. Tandy shrugged, lifted another bite of noodles to her mouth, and said the name, Ferraro. Adeline didn't answer. She was holding the carton of noodles in her hands, and she remained exactly that way, motionless, her eyes fixed on some point on the table. The silence lasted long enough for Tandy to look up. She asked Adeline what was wrong. Adeline blinked, gave a quick smile, and said it was nothing, that she was only trying to work out whether the shifts would overlap. Tandy studied her for another second, then returned to her noodles, and the conversation moved on to something else. Late that night, after Tandy had gone home, Adeline washed both cartons, turned off the kitchen light, and didn't go to bed. She went into her bedroom, knelt before the low cabinet beside the bed, and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, beneath a stack of insurance papers and several old medication logs, lay an envelope. The paper had yellowed to ivory, and all four edges were worn from being handled too many times by fingers that hadn't known what to do with it. Pinned to the envelope were 2 postal receipts. Both bore a stamp across the front, the kind postal employees used when the recipient refused to sign. Adeline sat on the floor holding the envelope for a very long time, long enough for the knuckles of her left hand to begin aching dully in the way they always did on nights when the weather changed. She didn't open it. She had never opened it. At last, she returned it to the drawer, closed it, and remained sitting in the darkness for a while longer. Then she stood, opened her laptop on the dining table, found the application for the private nursing position, and began entering her name in the first box. The interview took place in the kitchen, rather than the parlor, and that told Adeline more than any of the questions that followed. Rosaria Ambrosi pulled out a chair and told her to sit, then poured herself a cup of coffee, without offering one to Adeline. She had lived in that house longer than the curtains hanging over its windows, and she had no time for displays of courtesy. She asked how long Adeline had been working night shifts. She asked whether Adeline had ever cared for a patient with a spinal cord injury. She asked whether houses that were too large frightened her. Adeline answered each question briefly and offered nothing more. Rosie nodded, set down her cup, and said plainly that she didn't want to waste anyone's time. Before Adeline, a long line of people had come and gone. Some lasted a few weeks. Some didn't make it through the first one. None of them gave a reason when they quit, and Rosie had stopped asking. She said that if Adeline accepted the job, she shouldn't come believing she could heal anyone, because that belief was what had destroyed the people who came before her. Adeline asked whether the patient ever dismissed them. Rosie said no. The girl didn't say anything at all. That was the problem. As they spoke, Rosie's eyes passed over Adeline's left hand resting in her lap, the skin-colored compression glove fitting tightly from her wrist down over her fingers. She looked for only a moment, then turned away and didn't ask a single question. At the end of the interview, she pushed the contract across the table and said the pay came weekly. The room was on the second floor in the east wing, and she needed someone to begin on Monday. According to the rules of the house, she should have sent the applicant's file down to security for a thorough background check. She had done that with the previous 8 nurses. She was tired. She clipped the application into the folder, signed the employer's box herself, and simply told Bruno that a new nurse had been hired. On her first day, Adeline learned that she wasn't caring for one person, but 2. The elderly man on the 3rd floor was her morning patient. The young woman on the 2nd floor was hers through the evening and overnight shift. She went to the 2nd floor first. The bedroom door stood partly open. Inside, Juliana Ferraro sat in her wheelchair facing the window, both hands resting in her lap, and didn't turn when she heard the knock. Adeline entered, introduced herself, and placed the morning medication tray on the small table beside her. The moment she released it, Gia swept one arm across the table and knocked the entire tray to the floor. The packets of pills scattered. The water glass rolled in a circle before coming to rest at the foot of the bed, and water spread across the carpet. Gia still didn't turn around. Adeline looked down at the floor, then at the young woman, then pulled the chair from the corner of the room and sat facing her. She didn't pick up anything. She opened the file in her lap and began reading aloud in the calm voice of someone reading the morning newspaper. Last night's readings. Heart rate. The condition of the skin over the pressure points. There was already redness along the left hip. No ulcer yet. but there would be one if she remained in the same position for too long. Adeline read to the end, closed the file, and said she hadn't come there to make anyone happy. She said she had come to keep Gia's body from deteriorating any further, that Gia could hate her for as long as she pleased, as long as she changed position on schedule and took her medication properly, and that if Gia intended to knock the tray down every morning, Adeline would bring 2 trays because she was accustomed to doing plenty of walking. The room remained silent for a long time. Then Gia turned her head. She looked at Adeline, the first time she had looked directly into a nurse's face since the winter before last. She didn't speak, but she looked. Adeline picked up the packets of pills, blotted the spilled water with a towel, placed a fresh glass on the table, and left. By the middle of the morning, she went up to the 3rd floor. The old man's room smelled of medicine and aged wood. Cosimo Ferraro sat in a wheelchair beside the window, the left half of his body unable to move since his stroke. Adeline greeted him, said she was going to take his blood pressure, and wrapped the cuff around his arm. He showed no reaction while she worked, but when she removed the cuff and wrote down the result, she realized he was watching her. It wasn't the vacant stare of a sick man. He watched her for a long time without taking his eyes from her, and his throat began to move. He was trying to speak. 2 words emerged, distorted and wet, forming no recognizable word. Adeline leaned closer and asked what he was trying to say. He tried again. This time, even less sound came out than before. Then he stopped, his eyes still fixed on her, and his one working hand tightened slightly around the arm of the wheelchair. Adeline waited a little longer. Nothing else came. She wrote in the care log that the patient had shown signs of wanting to communicate, and recommended another assessment of his ability to speak. Then she drew the curtain so the sunlight wouldn't shine directly into his face, and left the room. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Adeline gradually learned by heart. She brought the tray upstairs at the proper time. Gia no longer knocked it away, but she didn't take the medicine immediately either. Adeline waited, and by the time she returned, the packets were always empty. Every morning she went to the 3rd floor, took the old man's blood pressure, entered the numbers in the log, and drew the curtains. She learned that people moved quietly through this house and spoke to one another in half-sentences. Then, one night, close to midnight, while she was sitting in the chair outside the 2nd floor hallway with a file in her lap, she heard footsteps coming up the main staircase. Alessio stopped at the end of the hall. He had just returned, his coat still draped over one arm. He looked at her, then at the small light she had turned on near the base of the wall, and asked why she was still awake. Adeline said she had given the medication later than usual because the pain had come on slowly, and she was staying a little longer to make sure it was working before she went to bed. Alessio said she didn't need to report to him. Adeline said she wasn't reporting. She was answering a question. He fell silent. No one in this house answered him that way. He placed his coat over the stair rail and walked toward her slowly, stopping closer than courtesy allowed, and when he spoke again, his voice had lowered. He asked whether she knew how the 8 people before her had left this house. Adeline said she didn't know and hadn't asked. He said everyone in this house knew when to take a step back. She raised her eyes, looked directly into his, and said she had worked the night shift in an emergency room long enough to understand that people stepped back when there was somewhere behind them to go, and she had nowhere. She didn't move, not even half a step. Alessio remained there for another moment, and the strange thing was that he was the one who turned away first. He wished her good night, picked up his coat, and walked toward his room. Bruno was waiting in Alessio's study the following morning. He said he didn't like having an outsider sleeping in the house. Under the old rules, strangers didn't spend the night beneath this roof, and if someone absolutely had to stay, that person had to belong to the family or be the child of someone who did. He reminded Alessio that his father had never broken that rule, not even when Alessio's mother was gravely ill. Alessio listened to everything. Then he said that if they had continued following the old rules, his sister wouldn't still be sitting on the 2nd floor. He said they had done everything according to the rules for 3 years, and the result was a young woman who hadn't spoken a single word to anyone. Bruno had no answer. He stood there a little longer, then walked out, and before closing the door, he said he was only doing his job. Alessio said he knew. Then came the rainy night. The storm swept in from the lake at dusk, the wind battering the great windows on the west side of the house, until the whole place sounded as though someone were walking across the roof. Gia's pain began earlier than usual. Adeline entered the room and found the young woman lying on her side, both hands gripping the edge of the blanket, Her jaw clenched, without making a sound. Adeline gave her the medication, adjusted the pillows beneath her hip and between her knees, and massaged the muscles along the thigh on the side that wasn't in spasm. The medicine needed time, and time was the hardest thing to endure in the middle of pain. She sat on the edge of the bed and, without giving it much thought, began to hum. It was the same melody her mother used to play on the piano in the corner of their living room long ago. She hummed very softly, almost nothing more than breath-given rhythm. Gia opened her eyes and watched her for a moment, then closed them again. Her jaw relaxed. Her hands released the blanket. About half an hour later, the young woman's breathing had become steady. Adeline pulled the blanket over her, turned off the light, and left the room. Her throat was dry. She went downstairs for water. The house was dark and empty, illuminated only by the light spilling from a few corners, while rain beat steadily against the glass. She walked through the long hallway toward the kitchen, and when she passed the great hall, she stopped. The white piano stood beneath its covering, silent as something that had been declared dead. Adeline had passed it more times than she could count during the last 6 weeks, and every time she had walked straight on. She knew the rule. Rosie had told her on the first day, briefly and without explanation. But tonight there was rain, and inside the sound of that rain, something old rose within her, something she had sealed away long ago and believed she had locked shut. She stood before the piano for a long time. Then she placed her glass on the small table beside it, pulled away the covering, folded it neatly, and laid it on the bench. Her left hand trembled slightly inside the glove. She placed both hands on the piano lid and opened it. Her fingers touched the cold ivory keys, and after a moment of hesitation, she began to play. The music poured into the empty hall until the final note faded into the dark hallway. Alessio stepped out of the shadows and stopped dead in the doorway. Tears welled silently in his eyes as he asked in a low, trembling voice, "How do you know that song?" Adeline didn't answer his question immediately. She rose from the piano bench, let her hands fall to her sides, and said she knew the rules of the house, that she would pack her things and leave that very night if he wanted her to. Alessio wasn't listening. He was staring at the keys. Then, in the same quiet voice, he said he wanted to hear it again. Adeline thought she had misunderstood him. She repeated that she had opened the piano without permission. He said he knew what she had done, and he wanted to hear it again from the beginning. She sat down. Her left hand ached dully in the way it always did on rainy nights, and she had to wait several beats before her fingers would straighten. Then she began again. This time she played more slowly, because she knew someone was standing behind her, and because she was afraid. But somewhere near the middle of the piece, the fear dissolved, not because she had grown braver, but because the music wouldn't allow her to think about anything else. Alessio remained where he was. He didn't wipe his face. He let the tears run down his chin and fall into the collar of his shirt, never realizing that in 3 years, no one in the world had seen him this way. When the final note faded, neither of them spoke for a very long time. Outside, the rain had begun to ease. Adeline lowered the cover over the keys gently, like closing the door to a room where someone was sleeping. Alessio walked to the long bench against the wall and sat at one end. After a while, she sat at the other. They remained separated by the entire length of the bench, neither looking at the other, like two people who had just crawled out of an overturned car and didn't yet know whether anything inside them was broken. Then Alessio began to speak. He said his wife's name was Beatrice. She had played the piano since childhood and had once performed on some of the city's finest stages. He said she was the only person in his life who had ever dared tell him no, and she had done it the first time they met. He told Adeline that he had offered to have someone drive her home, and Beatrice had said she could get there on her own, then walk to the train station through the snow in her performance shoes. He said that throughout the years that followed, whenever he was wrong, she told him so to his face. And while an entire city feared him, there was exactly one person inside his home who didn't. He said she had sat every evening in the same place where Adeline had just been sitting, and that during one season she had composed a piece of music she wouldn't let anyone hear through to the end, not even him, not even when he asked. He said she had promised to play it for him when it was finished. Then he fell silent. He didn't tell Adeline what came after. She didn't ask. A while later, he turned toward her and asked where she had learned that piece. This was the moment when she could have told him. The envelope lay in the bottom drawer of the low cabinet inside her apartment dozens of blocks away, and she knew exactly where it was, beneath which stack of insurance papers. She opened her mouth, then looked at the man sitting at the far end of the bench, at the face that had just broken open before her. And she thought about having to tell him that she had been there, in that room, on that night, and that she had kept something belonging to him for 3 years, without ever managing to deliver it. She didn't have the courage. She said she didn't know. She said she had sat down intending only to press a few keys, and then her fingers had somehow found the sequence of notes on their own, the way a person might remember the road back to an old home without having to think. She said perhaps it was only a coincidence. Alessio watched her for a long time. Then he nodded. He believed her. The following morning, Rosie came down to the great hall earlier than usual and found the piano still open, its covering folded neatly on the bench. She stood there for a moment with the tray held against her chest, then set it down, took a soft cloth from the cabinet, and began wiping each key. She worked very slowly. For 3 years, she hadn't been allowed to touch the piano, and her hands trembled so badly that she had to stop twice. Alessio passed through the hall and saw her. He said nothing. He paused for several breaths, then continued on his way. At noon, Bruno entered his study and asked directly about the night before. He asked why the nurse hadn't been dismissed and who had given her permission to open the piano. Alessio was signing papers. He didn't look up. He said that the next time Bruno wanted to question him about what happened inside his own home, he could submit his questions through an attorney. His voice was very quiet. Bruno remained there for 1 more second, then walked out. A few days later, Alessio called Adeline down to his study. He said he had someone inspect her room on the 2nd floor, and it was large enough for a good upright piano, one that could be delivered sometime that week. He said she wouldn't have to ask anyone's permission whenever she wanted to play. Adeline stood in the middle of the room with her hands folded before her and remained silent so long that he had to look up from the documents on his desk. Then she thanked him and said no. Alessio asked her to repeat herself. She said she had come to this house to work, that she was being paid to care for 2 people, and that if he put a piano in her room, then beginning tomorrow she would no longer be a nurse. She would become something else, a possession in his house, placed in a corner to be used whenever he needed her. There was no anger in the way she said it. She spoke as if she were reading out a blood pressure measurement. In this house, when Alessio Ferraro offered something, people accepted it. That was how things had worked since before he was born. He sat silently, the pen still in his hand. He wasn't angry. What he felt was far stranger than anger, like missing a step on a staircase he had climbed and descended all his life. He said, "All right." Adeline nodded and turned toward the door, and he remained where he was, watching, until she disappeared around the corner of the hallway. She didn't put a piano in her room, but in the late afternoons, after finishing her work on the 3rd floor, and before it was time for Gia's medication, she began going down to the great hall. She didn't ask anyone's permission. She didn't tell Rosie. She simply opened the piano, sat down, and played for about half an hour, then closed it and went upstairs. Her left hand still refused to obey her during passages that required a wide stretch, and she learned how to work around them, changing the fingering and leaving out notes so the melody could remain whole, even with less of it than before. The house accepted this in its own way, which meant no one said anything at all. The gardener paused longer when he passed the windows on the west side. The driver turned off the engine earlier than usual in the driveway. Then one afternoon, while Adeline was playing, she heard the sound of hinges. Gia's door on the 2nd floor opened about the width of a hand and remained that way. Adeline didn't look up. She finished the piece, closed the piano, and took the long way upstairs by the eastern staircase so she wouldn't have to pass the young woman's room. The next day, the door opened again. The day after that, it wasn't only the door. Adeline heard the wheels of a chair rolling slowly across the wooden floor, stopping, then moving a little farther before finally coming to rest beside the 2nd floor railing overlooking the great hall. She didn't turn around. She didn't change the piece. She continued playing as though there were no one else in the house, and when she finished, she remained seated for a while to give Gia time to wheel herself back to her room. It happened again over many afternoons. Then one evening, after medication time, just as Adeline left Gia's room and was folding a cloth to carry downstairs, she heard paper rustling behind her. A small piece of paper was pushed through the gap beneath the door. It slid into the hallway and stopped against the toe of her shoe. Adeline bent down and picked it up. 4 words were written there in the slanting hand of someone who hadn't held a pen in a long time. That piece belonged to B. Adeline stood in the dark hallway for a very long time. Then she knocked on the door. There was no answer. Through the closed door, she said she knew, and that she would play again tomorrow afternoon if Gio wanted to listen. The room remained silent. But the following morning, Rosie was the first person to see the note when Adeline brought it into the kitchen. She picked it up, read it, then read it again. She laid it on the table and smoothed it flat with both hands as though it were a shirt. She said the girl hadn't spoken a single word to anyone since the winter before last. Not to her brother, not to Rosie, not even on the day Rosie burned an entire pot of ragu, and everyone in the house had to open all the windows in the middle of January. Then she said she needed to step into the back kitchen for a moment to check the oven. She walked out. Adeline remained alone with her coffee. There was no sound of an oven from behind the kitchen door, only the sound of water running for a very long time, and Adeline pretended she couldn't hear it. That night, Adeline woke to the sound of people on the ground floor. It wasn't conversation. It was the kind of noise people made when they were trying to move quickly without being allowed to make a sound. She checked the clock, put on her robe, and went down to the kitchen. Every light was burning. 3 men stood around the long wooden table. Another man lay on top of it, and Rosie stood in the corner with both arms wrapped across her chest. Alessio stood at the head of the table with his shirt sleeves rolled up, his face revealing nothing. He turned to Adeline and said only one thing, that he needed her. Adeline asked why they hadn't called an ambulance. One of the 3 men started to answer, but Alessio raised a hand, and the man fell silent. He told her the hospital would be required to report the matter to the authorities. He said that in this house, the police came after the doctor, and the doctor came after him. Adeline studied him for a moment. Then she stepped to the table, bent over the man lying there, asked whether he could hear her, and saw him manage to blink. She placed 2 fingers against his neck, counted his pulse in silence, then looked up and began issuing orders. She told all the men to leave the kitchen, wait in the hallway, and close the door behind them. No one moved. She repeated herself, louder this time, saying she needed room and air, and they were taking away both. Alessio nodded toward the door. The 3 men left. He and Bruno remained. Adeline told Rosie to put a pot of water on the stove and bring her the adjustable table lamp from the dining room. Rosie hurried away, and within minutes the water was boiling on the stove. Adeline took her medical kit from the cabinet, spread a clean towel across the side table, emptied out what she needed, and arranged everything in the order she would use it. Then she stopped. She looked down at her left hand. The compression glove fit tightly from her wrist over her fingers, dulling the feeling in her fingertips. And tonight she couldn't afford to lose the feeling in her fingertips. She caught the edge of the glove between her teeth, pulled it off, and placed it on the table. There were 4 conscious people in the kitchen, and all 4 saw that hand at the same moment. The fingers couldn't straighten. The joints had shifted out of alignment, and old scars ran across the back of her hand all the way to her wrist, like a map of a road that had been dug up and filled in over and over again. No one said a word. Rosie lifted a hand to her mouth, then immediately lowered it. Adeline didn't look at anyone. She washed her hands, put on medical gloves, adjusted the lamp to the proper angle, and began working. She counted aloud. She had always counted aloud in the emergency room because the sound of the numbers kept her hands from moving faster than her mind. 1, 2, 3, hold. 1, 2, 3, hold. She told Rosie when to hand her a towel and when to pour water, and her voice remained so steady that Rosie was able to follow every instruction, even as sweat ran down her temples. She told the man on the table to look at the ceiling and breathe with her count, and whenever he stopped following the rhythm, she called the count more loudly until he found it again. Her left hand trembled. It trembled from beginning to end, and everyone standing near her could see it. But it never stopped, not once, and it never strayed from where it needed to be. Alessio stood 3 steps from the table without taking his eyes from that hand. At one point, Bruno reached forward to help steady the lamp, and Adeline told him not to touch it, to remain still, and he remained still. The work continued until the sky outside the windows began turning gray. At last, Adeline stepped back half a pace, lowered her hands, and said the man was stable. She said a doctor needed to examine him again that morning, and if he developed a fever within the next 2 days, they couldn't wait any longer and would have to take him to the hospital. She removed the medical gloves, dropped them into the trash bag, and leaned against the edge of the table as her legs began to remember how tired they were. Bruno rose from his chair. He had been in that house longer than Alessio, and throughout the past 6 weeks, he had never once called Adeline by name. He said, "Thank you, Miss Marsh." Then he went outside to call someone to clean up. Rosie brought coffee, set it down, and couldn't find any words. She simply patted Adeline's shoulder twice and turned away. Only 2 people remained in the kitchen. Alessio looked at the compression glove lying where Adeline had left it on the table. He said he knew a doctor in the eastern part of the country, the finest hand specialist in the nation, and that people waited an entire year for an appointment, but he could arrange one for her that week. He said it very carefully, like someone setting a fragile object on a table. Adeline picked up the glove, slipped it over each finger, and adjusted it snugly around her wrist. Then she said she didn't want to fix her hand. She wanted to use it. That weekend, Vittoria Sabatini arrived at the mansion in the middle of the morning, precisely on time as always, carrying her briefcase and the plans for the fundraising gala the 2 families organized together every year. She was the foundation's executive director, and she did her job well. No one could deny that, not even Rosie, who had never liked her. They sat in the small dining room with the seating chart spread across the table and discussed the guest list, who should be invited to speak that year, and the donations expected from several contractors in the northern part of the city. Vittoria spoke concisely and made notes in pencil, and when Alessio questioned one of the figures, she opened to the exact page without having to search for it. Near the end of the meeting, after the papers had been gathered and put back in order, she didn't rise immediately. She said there was something she wanted to discuss with him privately, and she hoped he would hear everything before responding. Then she took a thin bound file from her briefcase and pushed it across the table. Alessio didn't open it. He asked what it was. Vittoria said she had asked someone to look into the new nurse living in his house. She said at once that she knew he would be angry, and she accepted that because she would rather have him angry with her than leave him knowing nothing. Alessio opened the file. Inside was a summary of the financial circumstances of a woman named Adeline Marsh. There were years of unpaid medical bills that had accumulated into a figure Alessio had to read twice. There was a list of high-interest installment payments. There was a rejected loan application. Beneath those documents were photographs taken from a distance, poor in quality but clear enough to understand. Adeline walking out the main entrance of a long-term care facility called Cedar Grove with an envelope in her hand. Adeline sitting in her car in the parking lot with her forehead resting against the steering wheel. Adeline standing at the reception desk, speaking with an employee, a sheet of paper in her hand. Vittoria said she hadn't fabricated any of it. Everything in the file was true, and he could verify any line he wanted. Then, she said what she had come to say. She told him she didn't believe the woman was bad. Perhaps she was an excellent nurse and a genuinely kind person, but someone carrying that much debt, with a mother in a facility where she was at risk of being transferred away, was no longer in a position to choose freely. Desperate people didn't need to have bad intentions to do something terrible. They only needed to be tired enough. Alessio sat in silence. Vittoria continued, her voice lower now, saying that she had heard about the piano. She said the entire city knew what Beatrice had meant to him, and for 3 years she had watched how he lived. She said she had no right to interfere in his private life, but she had the right to worry because her father and his had sat at the same table since before either of them was born. Then she said one last thing, very softly. She asked whether he had ever wondered why no one had touched that piano in all those years, yet a woman who had been in his house for only 6 weeks had played that exact piece. She said she didn't have an answer. She only saw that he didn't have one either. Vittoria stood, gathered the gala papers, and said she would completely understand if he wanted to throw the file into the fireplace. Then she left, and at the door she turned back to remind him to confirm the guest list before the end of the weekend. Alessio remained alone in the small dining room for a long time. The file lay open before him. He looked at the photograph of the woman sitting in her car with her head against the steering wheel, and he thought about the trembling hand over the kitchen table the night before, and about what she had said when he offered to have it treated. Those 2 things didn't fit together, and he hated himself for sitting there trying to compare them. He closed the file, rose, and carried it into his study. He didn't burn it. He didn't show it to Rosie, didn't say anything to Bruno, and didn't ask Adeline a single question. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, placed the file inside, and locked it. Then he picked up the telephone and called the man who handled personnel background checks for him. He said he needed a detailed account of a nurse's professional history, complete, including every place she had ever worked and even the shortest contracts. He gave the man her name. Then he ended the call and sat for a very long time in the room as darkness slowly gathered around him. The report reached Alessio on Wednesday afternoon. The man who handled personnel checks brought it to the house himself, placed it on the desk, and said there was something he wanted to point out first. In the application Rosie had kept, under the section asking for the applicant's most recent employer, Adeline had listed a temporary medical staffing agency on the west side of the city. That answer was accurate and completely legitimate, and it was how thousands of nurses in the state filled out their applications because they signed contracts with staffing agencies rather than hospitals. The agency received requests for personnel and assigned available nurses to night shifts, and the same nurse might work at 4 or 5 facilities in a single month, while only the agency's name appeared on the paperwork. Because of that, he explained, no one would see anything by looking at the application alone. To see the full record, someone had to require the agency to produce a schedule showing every facility, every department, and every night worked, and that was what he had obtained. He said the report was rather long and that he had already marked several pages. Then he left and closed the door behind him. Alessio sat down, turned on the desk lamp, and began to read. There was nothing unusual in the first few pages. A rehabilitation facility in the southern part of the city, a nursing home, a general medicine ward at a community hospital. Night shift after night shift after night shift, every week filled, without a single week off. He continued turning pages. Then he stopped. Near the middle of the report, beneath the assignments from 3 years earlier, was a line bearing the name St. Coleman Hospital, Palliative Care Ward. Alessio read the line, then read it again, then a third time. His finger came to rest on the paper and didn't move. Beside the name of the ward was a column showing the dates of the assignment. He didn't need to remember those dates because he had never forgotten them, and for 3 years they had remained carved into his mind like marks in stone, the same nights, not one day out of place. He turned to the next page. The report was detailed enough to include room assignments, because the staffing agency calculated wages according to the level of care required, and had to record each room to verify its invoices. His eyes moved down the column. He knew the room number. He even knew where the bed had stood inside it. Beside the window overlooking the eastern parking lot, where sunlight entered for about half an hour every morning before disappearing. He had stood at the foot of that bed. He had sat in the plastic chair beside it, and he had signed papers on the small table at its end. The number in the report matched. Alessio lowered the page. He didn't rise. He didn't call anyone. The only sounds in the study were the clock on the bookshelf and the faint noise of traffic far away on Lake Shore. He thought about that night, about being in Detroit, about the telephone call near dawn, about the drive home, about the hospital corridor paved in gray tile and the smell of disinfectant, and about the moment he entered the room and found the bed already made smooth, the blanket folded squarely at its foot, while some nurse drew back the window curtains to let in the morning. He didn't remember the nurse's face. He never had. In 3 years, he had never once asked himself who had been in that room before he arrived, who had held his wife's hand in her final moments, or who had closed her eyes. He remembered only that he had returned too late, and he had carried that moment with him every night like a stone in his coat pocket. Now there was a sheet of paper on his desk telling him that the person had been sleeping on the second floor, fewer than 40 steps from where he sat, in the room in the East Wing, that she had entered his home 6 weeks ago, had eaten at his kitchen table, had sat down at his wife's piano, and played the exact piece no one in the world had ever heard to the end. And when he asked where she had learned it, she had looked directly into his eyes and said her fingers had found it on their own. Alessio reached out and turned off the desk lamp. He sat in the darkness for a very long time. Then he picked up the report, folded it in half, and left the room. He called her down to his study at nearly 11 o'clock that night. When Adeline entered, he didn't invite her to sit. He unfolded the sheet of paper, smoothed it across the desk, turned it so she could read it, and said exactly 2 words, "Tell me." Adeline looked down at the report. She saw the name of the hospital, the name of the ward, and the column listing the room assignments. She remained motionless for a long time, and Alessio allowed the silence to continue without pressing her or asking again. Then she said she needed to go upstairs and get something. He said all right. She took the eastern staircase and returned about 10 minutes later, carrying an envelope that had yellowed to ivory, its 4 edges worn, with 2 postal receipts pinned to one corner. She placed it on the desk before him and said it belonged to him, that it had belonged to him for the past 3 years. Alessio looked at the envelope but didn't reach for it. He asked what was inside. Adeline opened the flap, removed a thin stack of papers, and spread them across the desk. The first pages were sheets of music paper covered in handwritten notes, the pencil marks faint, some passages erased and rewritten, others trembling so badly they could only be understood by guessing. Beneath them was another sheet written in ink. Alessio recognized the handwriting on that page and had to place both hands on the edge of the desk. Then Adeline began to tell him. She said she had worked the night shift on that ward through the staffing agency, receiving assignments 1 week at a time, and that during that particular week, she had been assigned to the room with the bed beside the eastern window. The patient in that bed had reached the stage where nothing more could be done, except to ease her pain. On the second night, when Adeline entered to prepare the prescribed dose of pain medication, the woman caught her wrist and told her not to. Adeline said she had explained that without it, the pain would be severe, and the woman said she knew, but still told her not to give it. She needed her mind to remain clear. She said there was one thing she hadn't finished, and she didn't have many nights left. Adeline said she stood at the foot of the bed for a long time that night. She knew she was supposed to report it. She didn't. She lowered the dose to the smallest amount she was permitted to give, then remained in the room after completing her rounds and took up a pencil. The woman dictated every note. Some nights they completed half a page. Some nights they managed only a few measures before the pain returned, and they had to stop. Some nights the woman made Adeline play the passage back, while she tapped the rhythm against the side of the bed, listening to see whether it was right, then telling her what to change. It continued for 6 nights. On the final night, they finished it. Adeline said the woman had recognized her on the first night, though Adeline hadn't recognized her. She asked whether Adeline had once performed in a conservatory student competition held in Oak Park. She said she had been sitting in the last row that day. She had heard Adeline play Chopin, asked the organizers for her name, and intended to sponsor her continued education. She had even told her assistant to make the arrangements. Then, a few months later, she read a short article in the local newspaper and knew it was over. So she stopped looking. Adeline stopped there. She picked up the sheet written in ink and began reading it aloud to Alessio. She made it through about half a page in a steady voice, then stopped in the middle of a sentence. She looked down at the lines that followed. Then she folded the page in half, laid it on the desk, and didn't continue. Alessio didn't ask her to. He was staring at the sheets of music spread before him. Adeline said she had mailed the envelope twice, and both times it had been returned. Then she told him the last thing. She said she left the ward near dawn that morning after her shift ended, signed the handoff papers, and took the stairs down to the parking lot. She said he arrived not long afterward. They had missed each other by precisely the length of time he had been late. Alessio folded forward. He didn't collapse. He simply lowered his head and raised one hand to cover his face, his shoulders sinking like those of a man bearing a great weight that had been lowered onto him from above. It was a long time before he could speak. He didn't shout. His voice was so quiet that Adeline had to lean closer to hear him. He said she had kept this from him for 3 years. He said that for the past 6 weeks, she had walked through his home, eaten at his kitchen table, sat at his wife's piano, and when he asked her a question, she had looked directly into his eyes and answered him. He said he didn't need to know what reasons she had. Then he told her to return to her room, pack her things, and leave the house before dawn. Adeline nodded. She said she would leave immediately, then walk toward the door. But when her hand reached the knob, she stopped. She remained there for several beats, with her back to him. Then she turned, returned to the desk, removed the 2 postal receipts pinned to the corner of the envelope, and placed them in front of Alessio. She said that before she left, he should read them. Alessio looked down. They were 2 registered mail receipts, both bearing the same recipient and the same address of the house where he was sitting, mailed several weeks apart, and each had a stamp across its face, the kind postal employees used when a recipient refused to sign. Adeline said she mailed the envelope the first time and it came back. She thought she might have written the address incorrectly, so she went to the post office to confirm it and mailed the envelope a second time. It came back again. Then she told him the part she hadn't mentioned. After the second attempt, she had come herself. She took a bus to Lake Shore on a March afternoon, with the envelope in her coat pocket, and stood outside the gates of this house. She rang the bell. Someone inside the guardhouse answered through the intercom and asked who she was. She said she was a nurse from St. Coleman Hospital and had something belonging to Mrs. Ferraro that needed to be placed directly into her husband's hands. The person in the guardhouse told her to wait. She waited. It began to rain. She remained in the rain and continued waiting because she believed someone would surely come out that once they heard that name, someone would certainly come. At last, someone did. An older man in a wool coat walked all the way to the gate but didn't open it. He looked at her through the iron bars, examined her from head to foot, looked at her shoes, and looked at the bag she carried. He asked how much she wanted. She said she didn't want anything. She only wanted to deliver the envelope. He said he had encountered all kinds of people, that every time there was a death in this family, someone came crawling to the gate with a touching story and some piece of paper, and he didn't care how cleverly she had invented hers. He called her a fraud trying to take money from rich people. He told her to leave before he summoned someone to remove her. Adeline said she left. She walked to the bus stop and sat on the bus with the wet envelope in her coat pocket. And that evening her mother was taken to the emergency room, and after that she no longer had the strength for anything else. She placed the envelope in a drawer and didn't open that drawer for 3 years. Then she stopped. There were 3 people in the study. Adeline stood beside the desk. Alessio sat behind it, and Bruno Lazzari stood where he always stood, 2 steps from the door, both hands clasped before him. Adeline didn't look toward him. She didn't need to. Alessio raised his head very slowly. He looked past Adeline's shoulder and directly at the man who had been in this house since before Alessio was born, the man who had carried him around the grounds during the summer when he broke his leg, the man who had stood behind his chair at every important meal for the past 15 years. Alessio didn't ask a question. Bruno managed only one sentence. He said, "Yes, it was me." Then he fell silent. He didn't add that he had merely been doing his duty. He didn't say that 4 other people had come to the gate that year with invented stories, that he had been required to deal with every one of them, that he had done it so Alessio would never again have to hear his wife's name spoken by a stranger. He could have said all of those things, and perhaps every one of them would have been true. He said nothing. He simply stood there with his hands still clasped before him and looked at no one. The silence lasted so long that Adeline found it difficult to breathe. At last, Alessio raised a hand, rested his elbow on the desk, and pressed his palm against his eyes. He couldn't speak a single word. He didn't order Bruno out of the room, nor did he repeat to Adeline the command he had given her only minutes earlier. The 3 of them remained standing and sitting that way for a very long time, and none of them knew what to do next. Adeline didn't leave the house that night. The following morning, she still carried the medication tray to the 2nd floor, still went to the 3rd floor to take the old man's blood pressure, and still entered the results in the log as she did every day. No one mentioned any of it again. But from that night forward, the house had cracked in 3 different directions, and none of them led toward the others. The gala was held on the ground floor of the mansion at the end of the month, and what surprised the entire household wasn't the guest list, but Gia's agreement to appear. She wrote it on a piece of paper and handed it to Adeline, and the message contained one condition. She would come downstairs only if Adeline remained behind her wheelchair throughout the evening. Rosie had to sit down when she heard the news. It had been 3 years since the girl had crossed the threshold of her room on a night when strangers were in the house. That evening, Adeline wore a white shirt and black trousers with her name badge clipped to her chest, and she pushed Gia's wheelchair out of the elevator just as the crowd began to grow. People turned to look. Some came forward to greet Gia and didn't know what to say when she gave no answer. Adeline stood silently behind her, with both hands on the handles of the chair, and whenever she felt Gia's hands tighten, she smoothly wheeled her somewhere else, as though Adeline herself had simply decided she wanted a closer look at the painting in the far corner of the room. Vittoria ran the evening with a small notebook and 4 staff telephones. She had the access code to the service area, she had the personnel list, and she went in and out of the employee changing room several times that night without anyone noticing, because that was precisely what her work required her to do. Near the middle of the evening, just after the speeches ended, someone cried out beside the display case at the far end of the great hall. Vittoria stood there with one hand raised to her mouth. Beatrice's wedding ring, which had rested inside that glass case for 3 years and which everyone in the city knew belonged to her, was gone from its velvet cushion. Vittoria announced it in a voice loud enough to make 20 people turn. Then the logistics manager hurried over in alarm and added that the medical bag kept in the staff room had also been opened, and 2 vials of controlled prescription medication were missing. The entire room fell silent. Alessio walked over. Vittoria didn't look toward Adeline. She merely said very softly, but loudly enough for those nearby to hear, that she thought the staff area should be searched before anyone left the house. Adeline heard everything. She released the handles of Gia's wheelchair, walked directly into the changing room, and returned carrying her backpack. She didn't hand it to anyone. She placed it on the long table in the middle of the room, opened the zipper, and turned the bag upside down in front of everyone. Her belongings spilled across the table: a medication log, an empty lunch container, a spare compression glove, 2 vials of medication, and the ring. No one spoke. Alessio stepped forward, lifted the ring between 2 fingers, and looked at it. He looked longer than he needed to recognize his wife's ring. In that moment, there was no anger in his face, no certainty, and no trust. There was only something that paused very briefly between the 2 sides. Something people called hesitation. It lasted no longer than a single breath, but Adeline was watching him, and she saw it. She saw the man who had sat at the far end of the bench on that rainy night and told her about his wife. The man who had stood in the kitchen as the sky turned gray and watched her trembling hand continue without stopping. The man who had read the report and still allowed her to remain in his home. She watched him hold the ring and weigh it in his mind, weighing it against 6 weeks, against the late afternoons in the great hall, against the first note his sister had written in more than a year. And in the space of one breath, she understood that all of those things weighed less than the ring. Vittoria's accusation didn't hurt her. People had looked at her that way since she was 19, in courthouse waiting rooms, at hospital billing counters, and at the gates of this house beneath the rain. What hurt was that one breath. Alessio set the ring down and began to speak. He told the room this was an internal matter, that he would handle it, and that no one needed to mention what had happened anywhere else. Then he turned to Adeline, lowered his voice, and told her to return to her room. He said he would make this disappear, and no report would be filed. Adeline said no. She said that if he made it disappear, she would spend the rest of her life as the woman who stole from the Ferraro house and was protected by its master. She said she had already lost many things, and her profession was the last thing she could still stand on by herself, and she would rather lose it in an honest investigation than keep it through his pity. Then she removed the name badge from her shirt, placed it on the table beside the ring, and walked out. In the middle of the room, Gia struck her palm against the arm of her wheelchair. Once. Twice. She opened her mouth and tried to make a sound, her throat moving and her face turning red with the effort. No sound came. When Adeline reached Lake Shore, she made exactly one call. Tandy answered after the second ring and didn't ask a single question. She only said, "Come to my place." The following morning, Bruno summoned the head of security and ordered him to review every recording from the service corridor, beginning at the time the guests started arriving. There were no cameras inside the employee changing room. That was the rule. But there was one in the hallway leading to it. The footage showed Vittoria Sabatini entering the room, the door closing behind her, and then emerging sometime later while adjusting her sleeve. The interval between those 2 moments was long enough to accomplish what had been done, and too short to explain for any other reason. Bruno didn't stop with the recording. He questioned every server, and when he reached the 4th, he found a temporary worker who had seen Vittoria standing beside the employee lockers, but had been too afraid to say anything the night before, because she had been hired only for the evening. When Alessio placed all the evidence before Vittoria that afternoon, she didn't deny a single thing. She sat upright in her chair and said she had done it for him. She said the entire city was watching him, that for 3 years he had lived like a man only half alive, and now a woman drowning in debt had sat in Beatrice's place and played Beatrice's music, and he could no longer see what was in front of him. She said she needed to make him see. Alessio listened to everything. Then he told her that from that moment forward, the foundation would have a different executive director, that every partnership between their 2 families was over, and that she was forbidden from setting foot on any property bearing his name. He spoke in his quietest voice. Vittoria rose, picked up her briefcase, and left the house. The following morning, she personally filed a complaint with the State Nursing Board in her capacity as the Foundation's executive director at the time of the incident, reporting that 2 vials of controlled medication had been discovered in the personal bag of Nurse Adeline Marsh in front of multiple witnesses. The complaint was valid. The board opened a case. Alessio placed the matter in the hands of the family's law office and ordered them to prepare a complete defense. The attorney said that to build a proper defense, he needed to know everything connected to the client, including anything the opposing side might uncover later. So he had his people retrieve every legal record attached to the name Adeline Marsh. Not only the public records, They also searched the family's private archive in the basement of a building on the southern side of the city, where files were kept that no court had ever seen. That afternoon, the attorney called Alessio and said they needed to meet privately at once, and that it shouldn't be discussed over the telephone. The file was thin, its stiff cover faded with age, and a year written along the spine. Inside was the record of a traffic collision that had occurred 9 years earlier at an intersection on the west side of the city. A truck had run a red light and struck a car turning left. The truck driver was the son of a subordinate within the organization. His blood alcohol level was above the legal limit, and the truck carried cargo without any accompanying documentation. The driver of the car died at the scene. His name was Walter Marsh. The passenger suffered a traumatic brain injury and permanently lost the ability to speak. Her name was June Marsh. The person in the back seat suffered a crushed left hand and underwent 3 surgeries. Her name was Adeline Marsh, 19 years old at the time, and a first-year student at a music conservatory. The remainder of the file contained the settlement documents. The investigative finding had been changed to brake failure. 2 witnesses who had been present at the intersection withdrew their statements and received money. The truck driver was sentenced for a different, unrelated offense and released from prison in less than a year. The victim's family received what was described as humanitarian assistance from a fund that appeared in no official registry, an amount just sufficient to pay for 1 operation on Adeline's hand and not enough to restore anything else. On the final page, beneath the approval line, was a signature. The handwriting was so familiar that Alessio recognized it before he read the name beneath it. Cosimo Ferraro. His father, the old man in the wheelchair on the 3rd floor, the man whose blood pressure Adeline had taken every morning for the past 6 weeks, whose curtains she had drawn, and whose condition she had recorded in the log. Alessio didn't have the courage to tell her himself. He sent someone to Tandy's home with a copy and a handwritten line saying Adeline had the right to know. She received it late that afternoon. She carried it down to her car, sat in the driver's seat, and read it from beginning to end. She read her father's name. She read the line describing her mother. She read the line about her own left hand, written in the dry, lifeless language of official documents. She turned to the last page and looked at the signature. She didn't cry. She sat in the car until the streetlights came on, then put the key in the ignition and drove to Lake Shore. Knowing she needed answers, Alessio had already notified gate security and instructed Bruno to meet her at the rear entrance. Without a word, Bruno unlocked the door and escorted her directly up to the 3rd floor. She stood outside his bedroom for a long time. Then she pushed open the door, stepped inside, took the blood pressure cuff from the cabinet, and did exactly what she had come there to do. Rumors traveled faster than paperwork. By the middle of the week, the Council of Families summoned Alessio to a room above a restaurant in the old neighborhood that had been closed for years. 6 men sat around the table, all older than he was, and the man seated farthest away spoke first. He said they didn't care who Alessio slept with or who he shared dinner with. They cared that an outsider knew too much. He listed the facts without raising his voice, in the tone of a man reading an inventory. That woman had been in his wife's hospital room during her final week. That woman now possessed a copy of a file no one outside the 4 surviving people involved was ever supposed to see. And within a few days, that woman would sit before a state board, take an oath, and answer whatever questions they asked her. He said no one at that table could sleep peacefully knowing that. Alessio asked what they wanted. The man at the head of the table said they were giving him 30 days. Send her out of Chicago, sever every connection, give her no money and no lawyer from the family, or keep her and step down from his position. And when he left, everything would leave with him, including the protection the organization had extended to his sister since the day she was struck by a car 3 years earlier. He delivered the final sentence very slowly, so Alessio would understand every word. Alessio returned home and sat in his study until nearly dawn. The next day, he spoke with Adeline in the great hall beside the closed piano. He didn't mention the 30 days. He said there was a place outside the state, a quiet town with a good hospital, and he could arrange for her mother to be transferred there that week with all the proper paperwork, completely legally. He said she should leave. Adeline asked what he knew that she didn't. He gave no answer. She said she couldn't leave. The board hearing had already been scheduled, and if the person under investigation left the state before appearing, the case would automatically be classified as a refusal to cooperate. Then she wouldn't lose her license temporarily. She would lose it forever, in every state, with no possibility of ever recovering it. She said her profession was the only thing keeping her mother at Cedar Grove, and if she ran, she might save herself but lose everything else that remained. Alessio said he would take care of it. Adeline looked at him and asked how he intended to do that. He opened his mouth, but there was no answer. Throughout his life, whenever there was a problem, he made a telephone call. He transferred a shipping route. He placed a file on someone's desk. He had lived for 33 years in a world where everything had a price, and every door had someone holding its key. Now there was a state board he couldn't buy, a name already entered in an official ledger, and a woman who refused to run. For the first time in his life, Alessio Ferraro stood before someone he wanted to protect and knew he had nothing in his hands. That afternoon, Adeline drove to Cedar Grove. She arrived after visiting hours, but the nurse on duty allowed her inside because she had come often enough that no one asked questions anymore. June sat beside the window as she always did. Outside in the courtyard, the maple trees had shed nearly all their leaves. Adeline pulled up a chair and sat beside her. Not behind her as she did when brushing her hair, but level with her, face to face. She took her mother's right hand and held it between her own. Then she began to speak. She said she knew. She said the crash that night hadn't been caused by brake failure. She said the truck driver had been drunk, that the records had been altered, and that the two people who witnessed the collision had accepted money and withdrawn their statements. She told her where the money they had received that year had truly come from. The money her mother still believed had been charity from some church. She said she had seen the last page and read the signature beneath it. She spoke his name aloud. She said she was taking that man's blood pressure every morning. Her voice didn't tremble. She said all of it in the same voice she used when reading measurements aloud to her patients, because that was the only way she could make herself speak. June didn't answer. She couldn't. She looked at her daughter, and something moved very slowly inside her eyes. Then she gradually extended her other hand. She reached across the space between the two chairs and found Adeline's left hand, the hand inside the compression glove, the hand she hadn't dared touch once in 9 years, hadn't dared look at for too long, hadn't once allowed her eyes to rest upon while her daughter sat brushing her hair. She took it. She held it in her palm and didn't let go. It began with Rosie. She went up to the study one morning, stood in the middle of the room instead of sitting, and said there was something she had kept quiet about for too long. She said none of the nurses who came before Adeline had quit on their own. Alessio said Rosie had told him they resigned. Rosie said that was what she had told him because that was what they had told her. But she was the one who escorted them to the door, and she remembered every face, and none of them looked like people leaving because they had grown tired of the job. They looked like people leaving because someone had told them it would be better if they did. She said one of them, perhaps the 6th or 7th, had stood on the front steps for a long time on her final day, then turned back and told Rosie she should be careful before getting into her car and never making contact again. Rosie said she had thought it was merely something an angry person had said without meaning it. She didn't think that anymore. Alessio assigned the matter to Bruno. He worked for 3 days and slept very little. He recovered the old personnel lists and called every former nurse. 4 didn't answer. 2 answered and immediately hung up. The 8th agreed to speak with him at a cafe outside the city, and she said someone had contacted her by telephone without giving a name and offered her money to submit a resignation for personal reasons and never mention the matter to anyone in the Ferraro household. The amount was nearly equal to a year of her salary. She accepted it. She said she knew it had been wrong, but at the time she had 2 children and a lease that was about to expire. Bruno asked how the money had been transferred. She still had the bank statement. He traced it backward from there. The payment had passed through 3 intermediary accounts, and the final account belonged to a small event consulting company. The person who had signed the payment authorization for that company was Vittoria Sabatini. Alessio looked at the documents Bruno placed before him and said the first thing that came into his mind, that she was jealous. Bruno said he had thought the same thing at first. Then he turned to the next page. He said the first payment to a nurse hadn't been made 6 weeks ago or even that year. It had been made nearly 3 years earlier, before Adeline Marsh had ever existed as a name inside that house. It had happened immediately after Gia was struck by the car. Alessio sat in silence for a long time. Bruno continued slowly, like a man loosening a knot he had only just discovered. He asked whether Alessio remembered where Gia had been coming from that night. Alessio said she had been coming from their father's house. Bruno said yes, then asked which family they had been fighting at the time over the warehouse route at the southern docks. Alessio named the Sabatini family. Bruno said yes. Then he said the car that struck Gia hadn't stopped and hadn't left anything behind. And for 3 years, everyone in this house had called it an accident, because that was the only thing they could call it when no one had seen what happened. But someone had seen it. Only one person. The person inside that car. Alessio rose from his chair. Bruno continued, saying that his sister hadn't lost her voice because of her spinal injury, because the spinal cord had nothing to do with it, and the doctors had told them that from the beginning. She remained silent because she had chosen silence. And when someone chose not to speak for more than a year, it was usually because she knew something that would carry consequences if spoken aloud. Vittoria had eaten dinner in this house for 3 years. She ran the foundation bearing his wife's name. She asked about Gia every time she visited, brought flowers, sat beside the girl's wheelchair, and held her hand. And whenever a nurse began helping Gia improve, began making her respond, began persuading her to hold a pen, that nurse received a telephone call and disappeared within a few weeks. Alessio looked down at the bank statements on the desk and understood that for 3 years he had guarded this house against enemies outside its walls, while the thing keeping his sister silent sat at his dinner table once every month. He understood that Vittoria had never been trying to eliminate a romantic rival. She had been silencing a witness, and Adeline Marsh was the first person in all those years who had refused the money and refused to leave. The following morning, Adeline still went to the 3rd floor at the appointed time, because a work schedule didn't change according to what people learned about one another. She carried the care log and blood pressure cuff, knocked twice as she always did, then pushed open the door. Cosimo sat in his wheelchair beside the window, and from the threshold, she knew something was wrong. His head had fallen farther to one side than usual. The right corner of his mouth, on the side that could still move, was drooping. His right hand had slipped from the arm of the chair and hung loosely in his lap. Adeline set the log on the table and went to him. She called his name. He didn't respond. She told him to squeeze her hand if he could hear her, but the hand inside hers didn't tighten. He tried to speak. His throat moved, but no sound emerged. Not the 2 distorted syllables he had managed on the first morning she met him, but nothing at all. Then he raised his eyes to hers. It was the look that made her stop. It wasn't the terrified look of a man losing control of his own body. He looked directly into her eyes, and she saw something there that she recognized immediately. Something no one could conceal in a final moment. He knew. He knew she had read the file. He knew she had seen the signature on the final page. He had known before she entered the room that morning. Perhaps since the day before. Perhaps since the afternoon when she stood outside his door for a long time before finally pushing it open. And now he sat there unable to speak, unable to move, unable to call for anyone, while the only person in the house who could do something for him was the person he had signed a paper to erase 9 years earlier. Then came a silence. Adeline stood beside the wheelchair, one hand still holding his wrist as she checked his pulse, while images moved through her mind with terrible speed. She saw the kitchen table in their old house, where her father used to sit and tie her shoes on winter mornings. She saw the hospital hallway that night and heard someone telling her that he had died at the scene, that he hadn't had time to feel pain. She saw her mother open her mouth 3 months later and produce no sound, and the look on her face when she understood. She saw the practice room at the conservatory and the bench she had never sat upon again. She saw the nights she lay on her back in the apartment, with her left hand resting on her chest, calculating how much money she would still be short the following month. She saw the notice of the fee increase folded into quarters inside her coat pocket. She saw her mother take her left hand at Cedar Grove the afternoon before, after being afraid to touch it for 9 years. And she saw the final page in the file, the approval line, and the name beneath the signature, the name of the man sitting before her now. No one in the world knew she was standing inside that room. There were no cameras on the 3rd floor. In this house, the time between someone collapsing and another person discovering them was often measured in half a morning. No one would ask. No one would know. Then the silence ended. Adeline reached for the emergency call button mounted on the wall and struck it, holding it down for 3 beats so the alarm rang throughout the house. She lowered the guard on the wheelchair, slipped one arm beneath his shoulders and the other behind his neck, and brought him down to the floor in the way she had been taught to move bodies that could no longer support themselves. She placed him on his side, tilted his chin back to clear his airway, and pushed the pillow away. She unbuttoned his collar. She checked his mouth, checked his breathing, placed 2 fingers against his neck, and counted aloud. Her left hand did nearly all the work of supporting his head because her right hand was occupied, and it trembled, but it held. She told him the ambulance was coming, that he should keep breathing, that he shouldn't try to speak. She spoke in the same voice she had always used in the emergency room, the voice of someone keeping another human being on this side of life. Alessio ran upstairs only a few dozen beats after the alarm stopped. He froze in the doorway. His father lay on his side on the bedroom floor, and the woman his father had signed a paper to erase 9 years earlier was kneeling beside him, one hand supporting the back of his neck, and the other checking his pulse while she counted steadily aloud. Alessio couldn't say a word. The ambulance arrived soon afterward. As they carried the stretcher into the hallway, Adeline stood against the wall, and Alessio stood several steps away. He opened his mouth, but she spoke first. She told him not to misunderstand. She said she hadn't saved his father because she had forgiven him. She had saved him because she was a nurse. Then she said those were two entirely different things, and she needed him to understand that clearly. The night before Adeline was scheduled to appear before the board, Alessio took Gia and June out of the city. He offered no explanation to anyone, telling Rosie only to lock the doors and open them for no one. 3 cars traveled several minutes apart, changing routes twice on the western side of the city. Adeline sat in the back of the middle car with Gia, while June rode in the last vehicle with an attendant. About halfway there, Gia's body began to stiffen. Her legs straightened and pressed against the floor. Her back arched away from the seat, and both hands gripped the safety belt until her knuckles turned white. Adeline lowered the seat, supported Gia's head to one side, placed her hand between the back of Gia's neck and the seat, then began counting aloud and telling her to breathe with the rhythm. She told the driver to maintain a steady speed, not to brake suddenly, and not to change lanes. She massaged the muscles along Gia's thigh, waited, massaged again, continued counting, and told Gia the spasm would pass, that she was there, and that all Gia needed to do was keep breathing. Alessio sat in the front and watched through the rearview mirror. He saw the left hand inside the compression glove supporting his sister's neck in a car traveling down the highway at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. He saw it trembling, and he saw that it never let go. In that moment, he finally understood what had been before his eyes for weeks, and what he had refused to see. His world had crushed that hand, and that hand was now keeping his sister alive. They returned the following morning. The hallway of the State Board building was paved in gray stone, with long wooden benches against the wall, and Adeline had been sitting there since early morning with the file in her lap. Tandy arrived, still wearing her work clothes, dropped heavily onto the bench beside her, and said she had just traded shifts with someone she hated, so today she had officially made a sacrifice in the name of friendship. Then Tandy looked around the hallway at the people in suits, walking back and forth, and said she had been through every kind of room imaginable, but she had never seen one with so many people in suits, and so few who knew how to take blood pressure. Adeline laughed. She hadn't meant to, and she couldn't remember the last time she had laughed, but the sound escaped her, real and brief. Tandy patted her once on the knee and said nothing more. Inside the hearing room, proceedings began precisely on time. The attorney presented the footage from the service corridor. The presiding officer watched it, then asked whether there was a camera inside the changing room. The attorney said no, that regulations prohibited it. The presiding officer said the footage showed someone entering and leaving but didn't show what that person had done inside. He said the board needed something stronger. The attorney opened his mouth to continue, but the door to the room opened. Gia wheeled herself inside. No one pushed her. She moved between the 2 rows of chairs, stopped before the board's table, and sat upright. The presiding officer asked who she was and whether she wished to give a statement. Gia opened her mouth. Her throat moved. Nothing came out. The entire room fell silent. She closed her eyes, drew a breath, and opened her mouth a second time. Still nothing. Adeline started to rise, but Gia extended one hand toward her, telling her to remain seated. Then Gia tried a third time. This time, her voice emerged, so hoarse it scarcely sounded human, distorted and broken, forcing her to stop midway for breath, but clear enough to understand. She said she had been in the Great Hall that night. She said she had seen the person enter the service area. She spoke that person's name. She said the person who took those things wasn't her nurse. The presiding officer asked whether there was anything else she wished to say. Gia remained silent for a long time. Then she said that on the night a car struck her 3 years earlier, she had seen the vehicle and knew who owned it. It hadn't been an accident, and the woman whose name she had just spoken had known that from the beginning because she had come to visit Gia in the hospital afterward and told her what would happen to this house if she ever opened her mouth. No one in the room moved. Alessio sat in the back row, unable to breathe. And at that moment, Adeline opened the file in her lap, removed the inked page she had folded in half that night in the study, and handed it to the attorney. It was the part she had stopped reading and refused to finish. Beatrice had written that a few weeks before her illness grew worse, she had entered her father-in-law's study to look for insurance papers and found a file that had never been meant for her eyes. She wrote the name of the case, the year it occurred, and the names of the 3 family members who had been harmed. She wrote that she had intended to tell her husband, but she had run out of time, and she left one final line. If you ever meet the girl who played Chopin at Oak Park again, tell her that this family owes her a life, and don't let anyone repay that debt with money. On the 30th day, Alessio went to the room above the abandoned restaurant in the old neighborhood. The 6 men were seated in the same places. He didn't sit. He placed a file in the middle of the table and pushed it toward the man at the head. The man asked what it was. Alessio told him to open it and find out. The man opened it. No one in the room spoke for a long time. The man beside him reached over, pulled the file closer, turned several pages, then set it down. He asked Alessio whether he knew what was inside. Alessio said he knew every page. The man asked why he had brought it there. Alessio said he wanted everyone in the room to understand the situation before they continued speaking. Then he said, "This was only a copy." The man at the head of the table asked where the original was. Alessio said it was being held by a law office outside the state, under the name of someone no one at that table knew, and the office had been given simple instructions. If they received a call from his number before 5 o'clock every afternoon, they would continue holding it. If there ever came a day when the call didn't arrive, they would deliver everything to the federal prosecutor's office the following morning. A man in the middle of the table said Alessio was threatening them. Alessio said he was informing them. The man asked what would happen if Alessio had an accident. Alessio said then the call wouldn't come. No one said anything else. The man at the head of the table asked what he wanted. Alessio said he wanted nothing. Then he continued, and this was the part no one in the room had been prepared to hear. He said he was stepping down from his position, effective that day. Every operation bearing his family's name would be converted into a legitimate business within 6 months, with its books open and all taxes paid in full, and anyone who wanted to continue doing business in the old way would have to find another path. He said he would never speak to anyone about anything belonging to that table, but he wouldn't keep the old settlement file hidden. He would submit it to the prosecutor on Monday morning, complete and without removing a single page. The man at the head of the table asked whether he understood whose signature appeared inside it. Alessio said yes. The man asked again, more slowly. Alessio said his father had signed it, and he was submitting it. He picked up his coat and walked out. No one rose. That evening, he called Bruno into the study and said Bruno would oversee the transition, because he was the only person left whom everyone would still obey. Bruno listened until Alessio finished. Then he said no. He said that 3 years earlier, a young woman had stood outside the gates of this house in the rain with an envelope in her hand, and he had gone out there and called her a fraud. He said that for the next 3 years, he continued walking through this house and standing behind Alessio's chair at every important meal, and not once had he reconsidered what he had done. He said a man like that wasn't fit to sit in the chair Alessio had just left. He asked to be given some other work, any work at all. Alessio couldn't speak. He only nodded. That winter and the spring that followed passed in paperwork. The settlement file was submitted. Walter Marsh's case was reopened after 9 years, and this time there were enough statements, enough bank records, and both witnesses from the original investigation were willing to speak again. Vittoria Sabatini was charged with fabricating evidence, making false accusations, and concealing a crime connected to the hit and run. Cosimo Ferraro was charged even though half his body was paralyzed, and he could no longer speak, because a crime didn't disappear when the person who committed it lost his health. The family's attorneys requested a delay on medical grounds. The court denied it. On the day of the hearing, an ambulance brought Cosimo to the rear entrance, and a hospital nurse was assigned to take him into the courtroom. Adeline said she would do it. No one had asked her. Alessio asked whether she was certain, and she said she was. She accepted the handoff from the other nurse in the hallway, checked the oxygen tank attached to the back of the chair, adjusted the blanket over his legs, and fastened the safety strap across his waist. Then she pushed the wheelchair down the stone corridor, through 2 sets of doors, and into the courtroom. Reporters were there, Families of other victims were there. Alessio sat in the third row. Adeline pushed the chair to the place reserved for the defendant, locked the wheels, checked the oxygen tubing once more, and straightened. She stood directly behind him throughout the proceedings that day, and not once did she look down. Cosimo Ferraro didn't live much longer after the trial. One afternoon in the hospital care unit, while Adeline was adjusting his pillow, he lifted the hand he could still move and made a writing gesture. She gave him a sheet of paper and a pen. It took him a long time to hold the pen steady, and his handwriting trembled so badly that she had to look closely to understand it. There were only 2 words on the page. The same 2 words he had tried to say to her on that first morning on the 3rd floor. The same 2 distorted syllables she had recorded in the care log as the patient showing a desire to communicate. Adeline looked at the paper. She folded it into quarters, placed it in her pocket, and gave no answer. She pulled the blanket up to his chest, checked the oxygen tubing, and walked out. The following spring, extra chairs were arranged in the common room at Cedar Grove for a Saturday afternoon performance. The upright piano there was old, with 3 keys out of tune, and people used it only at Christmas. Adeline sat before it and played Beatrice's piece. She played the part Beatrice had dictated to her over 6 nights, then continued into the part Adeline had written later, the part her left hand could reach. It was slower than the original. It had fewer notes, but everyone sitting in that room knew they were hearing something true. In the front row, June hummed along, out of rhythm as always. Beside her, Gia sang the harmony in a voice that was still hoarse. Rosie began crying halfway through the piece, and announced to everyone around her that anyone who turned to look at her shouldn't expect a second helping of dessert that evening. Bruno sat in the last row with both hands resting on his knees, and didn't say a word throughout the performance. When the music ended, Adeline turned toward the room and said that many years earlier, people had told her this hand would never play again. She said they had been right. It couldn't play the way it had before. Then she said no one had ever told her she had to play the way she had before. That evening, in the great hall of the mansion, Alessio stood beside the white piano and told her he loved her. There were no cameras, no guests, and no one else in the house. He said he didn't love her because she had played his wife's music, or because she had brought the house back to life. He loved her because she was the only person who told him the truth at the precise moment when it was hardest to hear, and because she had never changed her answer simply to make him more comfortable. Adeline said yes, on 2 conditions. She would keep her profession, and he would never again make a decision for her. He agreed. 1 year later, the old school where June had once taught music reopened under a new name, the Second Movement, a music therapy center for people recovering from strokes, people who had lost the ability to speak, and people learning to move their hands again. The center didn't bear the Ferraro name. Gia worked as its coordinator and managed the entire schedule herself from a desk on the ground floor. June led humming sessions for people who had lost their voices, teaching with her eyes, with the rhythm of her hands, and in all the ways people still teach one another when words are gone. Rosie cooked for the entire center and complained endlessly that no one knew how to wash a pot properly. Tandy volunteered every weekend. Bruno drove patients to and from their appointments, and he remembered every name, every address, and every scheduled time. In the afternoons, children from the neighborhood came to play music with the patients. They fought over the benches, every child wanting to press the keys first, and their laughter filled the hallways until Rosie had to stand in the kitchen doorway pretending to look stern. Leaving the old world carried a price. During the first year, the windows of the house were thicker than ordinary glass, and Bruno still called every night before bed to report that everything was all right. 3 framed photographs stood side by side atop the white piano. Beatrice, Gia on the day she spoke again, and the children at the center crowded together before a piano far too small for everyone who wanted to play. None of the photographs erased another. This story leaves us with several simple truths. A person's worth doesn't lie in the uniform they wear, the debt they carry, or the hand that has been broken. Fear isn't a sin, but allowing fear to determine another person's value is, and some wounds never heal into what they once were, but they still heal. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that more warm and meaningful stories can find their way to you each day. How do you feel about Adeline and Alessio's journey? Please leave a comment below, because we truly want to hear what you feel deep within your heart. We wish you and your family lasting health, happiness, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.